Welcome to New Rechts, or for our English listeners, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about how the European Union is trying to undermine freedom of speech. And I'm happy today to talk to Dr. Norman Lewis about this topic, so thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And I guess the reason we're going to talk today is because you recently wrote a report for the MCC Brussels, a think tank that I think a lot of the viewers are going to be familiar with because I regularly talk to people from MCC Brussels. And I must say I was quite shocked about this report, even though nowadays we already know this is happening. But your title already spoke a lot of words with the EU-funded propaganda war against free speech doesn't say a lot of good things. And as people that don't know you, you could say, an expert on these kind of trends and also user behaviors in combination with technology and innovation and how that's adopted. So I think it's going to be interesting to talk about it. But before we do, I'm quite curious, why did you think there was a need even for such a report and to write it?
Well, it's a good question. Well, before I wrote this, I had written another report, which was called Controlling the Narrative, which can also be seen on the MCC Brussels website. And what that did was it looked at the relationship between the Commission, the big tech platforms, and all the organizations and institutions that surround particularly legislation like the Digital Services Act. So I was concerned about how the Digital Services Act was being used to control speech online. And when I did that report, what I came up with was this idea, what we call the EU's censorship operating system, which is basically how, through the Digital Services Act and some of the institutions, they have managed to control what can be said online. And I won't go into that in great detail, but the more I did that research, the more I came across projects and the terminology that was being used, and realized at the end of it that we had to look a little more closely at how the EU was controlling the language of politics, of political discussion in Europe. And it was basically through that I began to look. So I took apart, for example, the Digital Services Act. And if you just think about that for a second, most people don't even question that terminology. You know, the idea that we're talking about a service and the service happens to be free speech, but they're calling it a service. They don't call it the Digital Speech Act, or they don't call
Mm-hmm.
it the Digital Surveillance Act. It's a service. And if you think about the language of that, it already determines what the political discussion is about the DSA, which is that this is like a delivery system. It's an attempt by the Commission to make sure that the service that's being delivered, which by the way is speech, where speech becomes a commodity, which is like a utility. It's like and what the EU is doing in the language of the technocratic bureaucracy that exists in Brussels is to say, well, we want to make sure that that delivery system is optimal. In other words, that it's performing properly. And in fact, what it's really doing is it's saying, we're going to decide what can and cannot be said online. We're going to control freedom of expression. But the language disguises the whole thing. So this report was to look into how is it that they've actually monopolized that dialogue. How have they come to dictate how everybody in Europe thinks about, speaks about politics, about democracy, about hate speech, misinformation? It was through hate speech and disinformation that I began to investigate more about what they were doing. And what I uncovered, where I began and where I ended up, was completely different, because I discovered all these projects and suddenly realized there was something very systematic going on here. And that's what I've attempted to catalog in the report.
I can imagine that even if you are, like you said, already aware of some of it, when you have to dive deep into it, and indeed, I think it's a very good, profound point you made about the fact that speech is now made into a commodity, um, which is indeed a bizarre thing. But before we dive into the details of the report, I think maybe it's good to also outline for people that are maybe less familiar with the Digital Services Act and what's going on. How bad is the situation we are currently in? So to reframe, how much is the freedom of speech already being under attack at this moment?
Well, I'm afraid there's no easy answer to that, because a lot of the stuff that's happening we don't know about. A lot of it is not open to the public. Let me explain. What the Digital Services Act in a nutshell is that the Commission can decide what it regards as hate speech or disinformation, speech that it rules to be not correct. And it then insists that the social media platforms, the large ones, have to take down any notification that this is hate speech or disinformation. If they don't take it down, they can be fined, and the fines can be massive. It can be like 8 or 10% of their global revenue. So we're talking, billions. And so through this, they actually enforce the big tech companies to police what's being said online. But what's insidious about this, and I really want to make sure your viewers understand this, is that they do it in such a way that they themselves, I'm talking about the Commission, cannot be accused of censorship, because the responsibility for taking the stuff down is big tech, the big platforms. They have to respond to these things. And by the way, they also have a category of what they call trusted flaggers, which are organizations and member state like regulatory bodies who are given the status of trusted flaggers. And what trusted flaggers means that if they flag up a particular piece of content as hate speech or disinformation, the tech companies have to respond immediately. Ordinary citizens can complain, but they don't necessarily have to respond to that. And all of that is monitored, and there's a whole mechanism for that to happen. But the point is really important here is that the Commission basically says, well, what we're doing is to protect freedom of speech, right? And we're not the people that are doing it. Big tech are doing it. Big tech, on the other hand, are saying, look, if we want to be in Europe and we want to serve our customers, we have to comply with the rule of law. The Digital Services Act is a law. We have to comply. So we have to take this stuff down. We believe in free speech, but we have to be compliant. The courts, which are enforcing all of this, are just saying, well, we're enforcing the rule of law. Everybody who's doing this, what ends up is that we have censorship, the curtailment of speech, with nobody accountable for it. That's the remarkable thing. It's completely unaccountable now.
It's a profound system, I guess. Very devious in a way, and I would add for maybe the Dutch viewers that think that this is maybe far fetched. Even our own Minister of Climate and Green Growth, as they call it, Sophie Hermans, in a debate in our Dutch Parliament, even said openly that she has people working at her ministry who are busy with this kind of flagging and responding to social media content. So
Yeah.
it is already happening quite in a sense almost openly.
Yeah, well, 2 points. First is they get to define what hate speech is. Now, once if I say, for example, that anybody who criticizes current immigration policies, or somebody who's skeptical about climate change or about net zero or the Green Deal, that can be ruled as hate speech. And what is a legitimate political discussion, debate about issues that are affecting millions of people in Europe gets ruled out of order by this bureaucratic censorship machine. And the point, you asked the question about, is this really happening? It certainly is happening. The DSA, under the Digital Services Act, there is a database called the Transparency Database, which is accessible by the public. When you go into it, you'll be shocked to see the amount of stuff that is being taken down on a daily basis. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of posts. If you search through that database for hate speech, you will see thousands of things that have been taken down because they've been categorized as hate speech. The problem is that we as ordinary civilians do not get access to what the content is. It's just another data point. Oh, it's a data point. We don't know what the content was, why it was taken down, why it was deemed to be hate speech. Of course, there might be very good reasons. There might be somebody who's inflaming things, who's being really racist, or whatever. That kind of speech, which is not really acceptable, but it also could contain, as I said earlier, speech that questions immigration policy, that questions net zero. We don't know. So I would suggest that there's a lot of this happening that we don't know about. And if anything, one of our demands has got to be that this has got to become more transparent. Researchers can get access to this information, academic researchers or whatever, but to get that status, like everything in the EU, would take months of filling in forms, blah blah blah, and credentializing and all that. But it's not open to the public, and that's a big problem because we really don't know the scale of this, but we do know. And more importantly, that they are increasingly applying algorithms that will find so-called hate speech for flagging to be taken down, or in fact automatically taking it down, or indeed sometimes sending messages to people before they post it on these platforms, saying that this could be hate speech. Think about it. So even before you've said something, you're actually being told how to think about a subject that you might feel strongly about. So this is already institutionalized. It's endemic in the way that the social media operates in Europe today.
I think it's very serious, but I think maybe also a question that's important to understand here is it's not only how it's happening, but why. So why do you think that the European Union even cares enough to build up this entire system to actually, limit the free speech that ordinary citizens inside the European Union have?
That's a brilliant question, and I think it's the key to the whole thing. I think the reason why they're doing it is because they fear the demos. They fear free speech precisely because they can't control the debate. If you go back and trace where this comes from, the impetus for all of this occurred after 2016, after the Brexit vote, and after Donald Trump's first election in America. And this was the beginning, the real indication that there was a kind of populist revolt against the existing political parties and system. And the way that the technocrats, the political elite in Europe responded to that, they could not give anybody credibility, ordinary people, that they had legitimate concerns about the EU. The only way they could explain this, as far as the bureaucrats were concerned, was that people had been lied to, and that the demos are so stupid and impressionable and so easily swayed by adverts or Russian bots or whatever, that they could be easily persuaded to vote against what the EU thinks is their better interests. And so the more there's been this reaction to the kind of elitist top-down, I would say, complete contempt for ordinary people in Europe, the more there's been a reaction to that, the more the EU has dug its heels in, defending what it sees as its right to control the narrative, the status quo. Because and just be very clear about this, my reports about hate speech and disinformation, they are not it's almost like they are manufacturing this narrative. But they're not. Their goal is not to create the idea that hate speech exists. The real target of all of this is free speech. It's for them to have the right to determine what is legitimate political discourse, why far right, populist, whatever, is delegitimized in their view, and therefore to control how people think about politics in Europe. I think it betrays a real weakness on their part. The fact that they have to manufacture this just shows that it's not organic to the way people live and how they think as ordinary citizens in Europe. So it's a real top-down, authoritarian, censorious method that is really betraying the fact that they are very unsure and unconfident about their ability to control things. And that's why I think they're doing it. And that's why I think they're spending the amounts that they are to legitimize their position, which is increasingly being brought into question.
And I think people are always curious when we're talking about the money being spent. Do we have a clear indication of how much money we're actually talking about and how this is properly funded?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I'd say yes insofar as what we managed to do in this report is we searched a number of the funding databases. There's the Funding and Tenders portal, there's the Horizon program data, there's the Erasmus program, and in these you will find there are lots of projects that are given money as programs and etc. And what we uncovered is that on hate speech, discovering hate speech and disinformation, there was something like just under 450 projects that were being funded totally to the tune of about close to 650 million euros. And when I say no, I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there are lots of other projects that don't fall under the category hate speech and disinformation, but are very much part of the attempt to control the political narrative. And I've got a few examples in the report. So, for example, if you look in the Tenders and Funding portal and search for projects related to mental health, you'll see that the last time I looked at it, there were 227 projects. When I looked at some of the projects, many are genuinely mental health related projects, but many are not. Suddenly you discover a project that was about mental health for young Muslims actually becomes a project which is about how they should deal with social media. In other words, it's a kind of using this as a pretext to help them with their mental health, about how they should be spotting hate speech and disinformation and what they can do about it. It's almost like grooming young people to think in the way that the EU wants them to think. And this, the relationship to mental health is just kind of like incidental. But that doesn't feature in the figures that I've just quoted to you, because we haven't yet been able to go systematically through all of these projects and actually understand what they're about. That's going to take months because there's so much information and data available.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So yes, especially with this lack of transparency and clarity, I agree that the question is if it's even possible to fully unravel this without the help of the European Union and the European Commission, especially, which of course is not in their interest, as they are trying to put this forward. But I'm also curious, something that I think a lot of people lately have been hearing more about in the Netherlands is about the specific roles of these NGOs that you're also talking about. We've seen it in different ways that the European Union is trying to basically use NGOs as their private army almost to bring out their agenda on very many different issues. And I think freedom of speech is a very crucial one of that. I'm curious how you look at how they actually, they get these money, of course, these NGOs to quote unquote counter, hate speech and disinformation. How does it actually work for people to have a more concrete view of how the system for NGOs operates?
It's a very, very good question. Let me begin by saying that I think one of the biggest problems of all of this is how this process actually is destroying civil society. Because what's happened is a lot of these NGOs, when they began, I believe, were very genuine organizations who were really trying to uncover stuff, were trying to hold the powers to account. I mean, I've always had a problem with NGOs anyway, because they're not elected. They have got no mandate, popular mandate. They are self-serving organizations. But even sometimes, with the best intentions in mind, I still have a problem with them because, as I say, they're unaccountable in a democratic society, although they do have a role to play. But the problem with the system, and this is the point, it's a system, is that once you get drawn into it, you play the game, because if you don't play the game, you don't get the money. I can assure you, not one organization in Europe that applied for a grant or for funding for countering the hate speech narrative, or trying to prove that the hate speech narrative doesn't exist, would get any funding from the EU. I can assure you of that. You get funding because you play the game. And that means that you adopt the language, you adopt the assumptions, which you don't question, and you then fulfill your role within a specific area, which might be about monitoring or educating young people or whatever. But what you're effectively doing is you are legitimizing the process. You're giving the appearance that there is this kind of independent work going on. But let's be 100% clear. If you are receiving money from the European Union, I don't care how much, whether it's your full budget, 10% of your budget or 20% of your budget, you are already not independent, because you're being driven by an agenda of which might not be your own, but which you have to feed. Otherwise, you're out of the loop. And that's what's happened. And it's not just the NGOs, it's the universities. And I'm particularly concerned about the universities, because when you look at the concept of research, a lot of these things are so-called research. They're not research. They are simply programs that already know what the answer is before they've started. They're not trying to uncover real truth. They're not trying to when you do research is about discovering new knowledge. It's about questioning the assumptions upon which you're doing it, how new things. Here, all the projects, and I outlined quite a lot of them, begin by simply repeating the assertion, which is hate speech is a big problem for the future of democracy. Hate speech is growing extraordinarily in Europe. No one questions this. No one says, well, actually, no, it's not. What is the distinction between hate speech and ordinary and free speech? Who says it's hate speech? Who decides all of that? They don't question that. They simply say, at the end of all their work, and this is what's amazing, what's remarkable is that they all come up with the same answer. More research is needed to uncover the hidden hand of hate speech. Hate speech is so elusive. And the reason why it's so elusive is because hate speech is a very difficult thing to define. It's in the eye of the beholder about what hate speech is. Now that we have this with identity politics and the victim culture, if I'm a victim and I decide that what you've said is hateful, that's hate speech as far as they are concerned. That's it doesn't matter whether it is or not, but it could be legitimate questioning of your position or whatever. So what's happened is it's not just they're corrupting civil society. I think they're corrupting academia as well, and academic research. And I think that's got hugely important implications for the future in terms of what the university is, or what it should be, and what service it should be providing. And so you've got this system that is self-fulfilling. It's like a recursive loop, which every time you put more money in, you create these organizations, or you help these organizations to create these networks who prove your assumption to be correct, and therefore require that more work should be done. So it just constantly feeds itself. And you find the hate speech discussion might start with race or religion or sexuality, and now extends to disability, to gender identity, to, all of a sudden you have this expanding empire of hatreds. And all it does is it's saying, well, we need more research. We need more research. And the EU will throw more money into it, because the fact that these organizations are saying that proves to them, and allegedly to the rest of the world, that their focus on this is correct. There is a big problem here. And they're actually manufacturing the problem. That's
Yeah.
the thing. They are reliant upon hate speech and disinformation. Something, the very thing that they're supposed to be outlawing, they're actually reliant on this being constantly being reinforced in order to justify their clampdown on speech.
I think it's a profound point, and I think people need to maybe realize, indeed, offense in many cases is taken. Of course, if you're calling up for violence against specific people, this is very different, right? And I think even in, let's say, America, where free speech has, under the First Amendment, much more support, you could say. Even there, of course, if you cover violence, that cannot be allowed.
Yeah.
But I think, as a society, we need to find other ways indeed to deal with this, besides having governments trying to force it down. It makes a much more healthy society, right? As a personal example, I have a Jewish background, and I do get a lot of, especially now since the heat of the Israel-Gaza debate with Hamas, for taking a stand. Of course, I get a lot of hate for that, but that's basically based on my decision to be open on my own stance there. So I could go cry as a victim about that, and of course, a lot of things that are being said, I don't appreciate very much.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter though, because the other people also have a right to say those things, even if I highly disagree with that. And I think that's a more healthy outlook on these issues, also as a society.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. You're right to make the distinction between hate speech and incitement to violence, and that already is covered by criminal law. Right? It's not. We don't need more legislation. You cannot incite violence, etc. And I think that should be ruled. That is legitimate to control that. But my response to the hate speech discussion is, sorry, the point is that hate speech does exist, and as you've just said, the rise of anti-Semitism now, these things do exist, and they are harmful and they are hateful and everything. But the answer that the EU Commission gives, that this needs to be stopped, this needs to be censored, this needs to be curtailed, is not the only response that we can have to hate speech. In fact, the real answer to hate speech is free speech, is more speech, is our ability to conduct a public debate in the light of the public about some of the disgusting views that people have about Israel or about Jews or about black people or whatever. The way to counter hate speech is more speech, not less speech.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would argue that because words are powerful and because words can harm, it's precisely why we need to defend free speech, not curtail it. Because in history, speech and words have been used to change society for the better. Challenged orthodoxies were harmful to the people that were the status quo. Think about the church. Think about go back in history, the importance that there was of people being able to stand up and speak out against existing system, which resulted in social transformations that have given us, modern democracy, for example. So, so the assumption behind the EU position on all of this is that we, as the ordinary people, lack the moral autonomy and the moral independence to be able to conduct an adult conversation. But they, as our betters, who they think they are better than us, that they know better than we do about what our interests are, they should control. They should, oversee, and where necessary, nudge us or stop us or whatever to protect us from ourselves. If you think about it, and this I really would like your viewers to really grasp, what's really behind this is hatred. It is hatred for ordinary people. It's contempt for ordinary people, that they assume that, when I say they, I mean the Brussels bureaucrats, the political elite, that they have all the answers. They know what's right for everybody. And, they're going to do this to protect us from ourselves. Well, they can, jump in the nearest river, as far as I'm concerned. I think ordinary people have got more wisdom than any of these technocrats. And that's what we need to defend. That's really ultimately what this is about. So my report is not only pointing to the fact that they are spending 30% more on controlling the narrative than they do, for example, on cancer research, cross-border cancer research in the EU over the same period. But they fear the cancer of free speech more than they do the disease. That's, we've really got to get across that this is such a fundamentally important issue, that it's not just about the money, the taxpayers' money that's being spent without any accountability. It's about democracy. This report is a call for us to become vigilant about defending political speech, to defend meaning, to defend our right to decide, our autonomy. That's really what it's all about. And that is I think the taxpayers' money is an important issue, but the language war is even more important, because that controls how you can think. It controls the possibilities of alternatives. They know that if they can control the language and the conversation, they control our heads, our minds, they control society. We cannot allow that to happen. I mean, that's really what this report's aiming to do.
I couldn't agree more. I think a lot is at stake. Maybe it's good to take maybe one or two of these projects also to give a clear example. You outline a few like Veslisa, Titan, Orbis. Is there one of two of them that you think that makes it very clear to our listeners and viewers
Well, I
how
mean,
the system operates?
I haven't got the example. I can read the example to you. I mean, the people should look at the report, because it's got a lot of
Hmm.
detail in there about the reports. But what I've done in it as well, I mean, it's very interesting that you mentioned this free Lisa. Now, free Lisa is an acronym for a project name, and when you look at these project names, they emphasize different things. Different letters become capital letters in order for them to create this acronym, which is easier to speak about than these long-winded academic. Sometimes they sound completely ridiculous, the names of these projects. But the acronyms are very sweet, because they're things like Free Lisa, or I can't even some of the other ones. I think you've got them there.
Yes, like Reason or Titan.
Yeah.
These are Vera AI, Vigilant. There were quite a few that
I mean,
you basically pointed out in your report.
they sound like digital assistants, or they even sometimes they sound like they're advertising toothpaste.
Yes.
They come across as these very cute little names, but actually, when you look at the projects, they're very far from being cute. They're very much about controlling, either educating young people to think in the way of the EU. So they are very dishonest. That's the point. They are very dishonest in terms of what they are purporting to say and what they actually mean. So what I've done in the report is I've got these tables of all the different projects we just highlighted 10. There's we're talking about almost 450 of these projects, and I don't have the space to. I'd love to expose all of them, but they all have
Hmm.
the same language. So what I've done is I've taken what the project says it does in the language that it uses. I've then translated that into English so that ordinary people can understand what they actually mean when they talk about capacity building, or or empowerment or whatever, or distributive democracy. They use these fantastic concepts. So I've translated that into English, and then I've translated into what it actually means. What I term, along the lines of George Orwell's Newspeak, I call this NEU speak, Newspeak. It's an entire language that they have created, which everybody, that's the point. The NGOs, the academics, everybody plays along with it, and when they put these projects together, they do it in such a way that they can create these acronyms that sound sweeter than sweet, but actually betray a real authoritarian purpose. And then I explain what that actually means in reality, what they're actually doing. So when they talk about capacity building, they're actually talking about empowering young people to think and act as language police or speech police on the internet. Whereas in the words of saying, well, we're giving them the power to determine their own position. Nothing like that. There's no consultation. These are top-down programs where the possibility of the people involved in them questioning it and developing something together, they all follow a template. They all follow a script, and the outcomes are all very, very clear. And all this stuff is available on the database. If people read the report, read those reports, but then also follow some of the links and go and check it out yourself, and you'll discover what I'm talking about. It's industrialized. It's industrialized.
Yes, I agree. People should indeed also make up their own mind. But I think that this leaves one crucial, maybe the most crucial question in the end is, let's say people hear this and they're like, okay, we need to stop this. Then the real question becomes, what can we actually do to turn things around and defend free speech inside Europe?
Well, I think in the first place is to stand up for free speech, is to call it out wherever we come across it, to campaign against it, to demand. I think, for example, this year there's going to be, in November, there'll be, excuse me, a review of the DSA. It's the kind of first year and I think we should be part of that conversation. And our conversation should be, we want access to all the data. We're not prepared to accept these rubbish reports where you give us global figures and everything. We don't know what you're talking about. We want to see the content. We want to know what that is. I think that in Europe we should be campaigning against the Digital Services Act. I think we should be calling for its abolition. That's something that is very real. But I think most importantly, and this is probably the most important point, as you say, is for us to be more critical in relation to what the EU claims and the stuff that they put out. And most importantly, never, ever to be censoring ourselves, because this is what the DSA is really about. It's about saying to everybody in Europe, be careful of what you put on. Be careful of what you say online. In other words, censor yourself. In other words, it's kind of they want you, every time you're going to post a tweet to X or to TikTok or to Meta, Facebook or whatever, they want to say, before you press the enter button, think, is this harmful? In other words, it's almost like they are silencing us before we've even said anything. And that's the point about this how insidious this is. This is not about the Gestapo, knocking on our doors, although that's starting to happen. This is not about being, thrown in a concentration camp for saying the wrong thing. This is about creating concentration camps in our own minds where safety and what's safe becomes the norm, where we begin to censor our own thoughts and speech because we're afraid that we might be transgressing the law. And if that happens, then we've really got a big problem, because you don't need laws to throttle democratic discussion. If people are doing it themselves and this is what the impact of all of this is about, then free speech doesn't exist. And free speech is not something that is abstract. It's not something that is given to us. Free speech either lives or dies by the practice that we do every day in our lives, whether it's in the conversations, whether it's online, whether we're writing or reading. It's the freedom that we require that we've got to counter, and that's one of the major reasons why we produced this report, is to highlight, to bring this out into the public realm, to say, look, wake up. This is what's really going on here. Is this? Do you find this acceptable? And of course, the vast majority of people either don't know about it, or they oppose it. The common sense. We're talking about the demos here, the wisdom of the masses, which I would place 100% of my faith in, rather than any technocrat in Brussels who's got a degree and a long academic record of service to the institutions of the EU. Ordinary people, the wisdom of people, and we've got to make sure that that's what is allowed to flow and is not curtailed in any way, either by law or by self-regulation. And I think for me, that's the critical thing.
Thank you very much. I think you gave a beautiful case on what's at stake, how freedom of speech is being attacked, and what we can do about it. Let's say people want to follow more of your work. Where could they do that?
Well, you can follow me personally on Facebook, or Norm Lewis, or just sign up to the MCC Brussels newsletters. Follow us on social media. All our stuff is published. We have a lot of stuff on YouTube and our website. I suggest people start doing that, and more than that, join the conversation, and come to our meetings. Get active yourself. Start these discussions with your family and friends when you're in the local restaurant or pub, and just spread the awareness of this. This is it is urgent. We really do. We are dealing with a big machine, and a machine that's going to increase, not decrease. And the more the populists rise, the more they're going to step up their narrative against us. And so, we've really got to be vigilant. In the words of one of their projects, we've got to become vigilant and hold them to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, I also want to thank all our listeners and viewers of Nieuw Rechts. Without you, this would not be possible. So if you want to continue to help us make these kind of conversations possible, please consider subscribing at nieuwrechts.nl, and I will see you in the next one.